Here's a look at what's happening today. A killer will be sentenced for gunning down a Detroit mother of two almost a year ago. And as Nick Monticelli shows us, the murder left a family and a community in shock.
Good morning to you. If you remember this case, this was just a brutal day when all this happened, and continued to be for the family for weeks and months after the fact. Not only was she killed in front of her 4-year-old, but she was also killed near her 14-year-old son. And now the man accused, that Earl Maxwell, will find out how long he'll spend in prison. After pleading guilty today, Earl Maxwell will be sentenced for the murder of his girlfriend, Latrese Morris-Dorsey. She had dated Maxwell for 4 years, right up until she was murdered. At an earlier hearing, it was said Morris-Dorsey was dating someone else, and clearly Maxwell was upset. Her estranged husband testified about a few phone calls with Maxwell.
What did he say the first time you spoke?
When I see your wife, I'm going to kill her. The second time he called, he reiterated that he was going to hurt her.
That was 2 weeks before this murder on Avon. She was shot several times in front of her 4-year-old daughter. Her 14-year-old son was also in a nearby room. Before Maxwell pled guilty to this murder, the prosecutor pointed to a statement he made.
In his statement, claims that he accidentally shot Ms. Dorsey 10 times. He specifically indicates that he accidentally shot her in the back of the head, in her hands, throughout her body.
Now, there are other factors to this, but Maxwell pled guilty to first-degree murder, so he is looking at life in prison. In the newsroom, Nick Monticelli, Local 4 News today.
The first bullet ripped through the air before she could even take a step. The second silenced her scream. By the time the 10th bullet hit, the room was swallowed in a silence, so heavy it felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath. A 4-year-old stood there, eyes wide, frozen in terror. Her name was Latrese Morris-Dorsey, 42 years old, mother of two. She had spent her life building a safe home for her children, a place meant for laughter and love. But that night, love wasn't in the room. Only jealousy, only rage, only the man she had trusted for years, holding the gun that ended her life. 2 weeks before her death, he had said the words no one wanted to believe. "When I see your wife, I'm going to kill her."
What did he say the first time you spoke?
When I see your wife, I'm going to kill her.
They were dismissed, forgotten. And then, on a warm June evening, he kept his promise. If you believe no one you love could ever do this to you, subscribe now. Because every victim in these stories thought the same. They believed the danger lived somewhere else with someone else. And by the time they realized it was standing right in front of them, it was too late. If you choose not to subscribe, go to the comments and tell the world why you think it will never be you. This is the story of a jealous ex-boyfriend, a mother of two, and 10 bullets that destroyed more than one life.
Welcome to Twisted Crimes Files, where the darkest truths come to light. Stay with us for chilling stories you won't forget, and be sure to subscribe so you never miss a case.
Latrese Morris-Dorsey was 42 years old. She lived on Detroit's west side, in a modest home on the 20060 block of Avon Avenue. To the people who knew her best, she was more than just a neighbor or a coworker. She was the heartbeat of her family. A mother to 2 children, a 14-year-old son and a 4-year-old daughter. She carried herself with a warmth that made people feel safe. Friends describe her as someone who lit up a room the moment she walked in. She was generous with her time, often helping others even when her own life was complicated. She was separated from her husband, Paul Dorsey, but they remained connected because of their children. Despite the challenges, she fought to create a stable home. Her social media was filled with snapshots of everyday joy: a child's birthday cake, a Sunday dinner table, a smiling selfie in her favorite outfit. But behind those moments were struggles she rarely shared. Like many women, she carried the weight of her personal battles quietly, choosing to focus on her children's happiness. Latrese's life was not perfect, but it was hers, and she was determined to protect it. What she didn't know was that someone she loved and trusted was preparing to take it all away. His name was Earl Maxwell. To outsiders, he was Latrese's boyfriend of nearly 4 years. To Latrese, he was someone who had been there during both good and difficult times. He knew her children. He had been inside her home countless times. He wasn't just a partner. He was part of her daily life. In the beginning, the relationship had its share of charm. There were shared meals, nights out, quiet moments where they laughed over nothing at all. But slowly, small cracks began to show. Cracks that, in hindsight, were early warnings. Friends would later recall subtle signs, his possessive glances, his need to know where she was and who she was with. He could be warm and attentive one day, then cold and distant the next. He noticed changes in her tone, her routines, her phone habits. And when he suspected another man was in the picture, those cracks widened into something dangerous. To the outside world, they were still a couple. To those close enough to see, the relationship had begun to shift. Arguments became more frequent. Conversations that should have ended peacefully began with questions and ended with accusations. And while Latrese was known for her patience, even she was starting to keep more of her life private. She had no way of knowing that the same man who once held her close would one day aim a gun at her chest. 2 weeks before the shooting, the tone of Earl Maxwell's presence in Latrese's life changed completely. What had once been frequent, casual check-ins turned into a flood of obsessive contact. When Latrese stopped answering his calls, he didn't simply wait for her to respond. He found another way in. He began calling Paul Dorsey, her estranged husband. Paul would later testify that Maxwell called him more than 20 times in just a couple of days. The calls came at all hours, morning, afternoon, night, and every time, the subject was Latrese. Maxwell accused her of cutting off communication, of avoiding him, of disrespecting him. In one of those calls, his voice carried a sharp edge, and the words he spoke were impossible to ignore. "When I see your wife, I'm going to kill her." Paul didn't brush it off. He told Latrese about the threats, word for word. She heard them, and she understood them. But like so many people who've been threatened by someone they know, she may have believed the anger would pass. She may have thought the danger would dissolve with time. The threats didn't stop there. A second call came, and Maxwell repeated himself, not with hesitation, but with conviction. He claimed he was serious, and in that moment, the line between anger and intent blurred dangerously. Then, just as suddenly as the threats had begun, another call came. His tone was different, calmer. He recanted the threat. He told Paul he didn't mean it. He suggested they should all just get their business together and move forward. To an outsider, it might have sounded like resolution. To those who understand cycles of control and abuse, it was a false calm, the kind that often comes just before the storm. In the days that followed, Maxwell's frustration simmered beneath the surface. Friends of Latrese noticed he seemed more withdrawn when she was around other people. At times, he avoided public arguments, but his demeanor spoke volumes. Tight jaw, narrowed eyes, a silence that felt more like a warning than peace. On social media, Latrese posted as she normally did, pictures of her children, snapshots of everyday life. There was no sign in her public words that she was living under the weight of a man's growing jealousy. If anything, she appeared determined to hold on to her normal routines. But on Maxwell's end, the pattern was shifting. He was making unannounced visits, lingering outside her home, watching from a distance. Whether she noticed him every time is unclear, but those close to her would later say that she had begun to feel uneasy in her own neighborhood. The final week before the murder passed with tension building quietly. There were no reported public confrontations, no police calls to the home. From the outside, it looked like life had returned to normal. But in reality, the countdown had already begun, and each day brought Maxwell closer to the moment when talk would turn into action. The first days after Maxwell's threats passed without incident. To most, it would have looked like the storm had cleared. But the truth was it hadn't. It had simply gone quiet. In abusive relationships, quiet isn't peace, it's pressure, building silently until something gives. In the 2 weeks leading up to June 18th, Maxwell kept himself within reach of Latrese's life. Sometimes that meant his car parked just far enough from her house that it wasn't obvious. Sometimes it meant an unexpected phone call at odd hours, his tone casual on the surface, but with a weight underneath it that hinted at unspoken resentment. Neighbors saw him in the area more often than before. They noticed how long he lingered outside when he arrived. He didn't always knock. Sometimes he just waited, watched, left. Those moments didn't seem alarming at first. Not to outsiders, but in hindsight, they were part of the slow tightening of control. As the days went on, Latrese carried on with life the way she always had. She took her children where they needed to be. She checked in with friends. She kept her home a place of comfort. To anyone scrolling past her posts online, it was the same woman, smiling, holding her daughter, showing pride in her son's achievements. There were no visible signs that danger was circling. The weekend before Father's Day, the city moved with its usual summer rhythm: block parties, music spilling from passing cars, families gathering in backyards. On the morning of June 18th, the day began for Latrese the way it often did, quietly. Her 4-year-old played in the living room while her 14-year-old kept to his room, music low in the background. Friends later said she had no plans for anything unusual that day. No big outing, no dramatic changes. She was at home, the place she should have been safest. But somewhere not far away, Maxwell was in motion. Whether it was a decision made in the moment or the conclusion of a plan he'd been building for weeks, only he knows. But by that afternoon, he was on his way to her home on Avon Avenue. The air inside the house was still just moments before it happened. Sunlight cut through the half-closed blinds, drawing lines across the living room carpet. Somewhere down the street, music from a neighbor's speaker drifted faintly through the open windows. It was Father's Day. Latrese had been moving about the house, keeping one eye on her 4-year-old daughter, who was busy with toys on the floor. In another room, her 14-year-old son sat with his headphones around his neck, scrolling through his phone. Life was quiet, ordinary, the way Sundays in early summer often were. And then it began. Maxwell entered. The front door, which had been closed against the heat, opened to let him in. He stepped across the threshold without hesitation. There was no loud greeting, no warm smile. The air seemed to shift immediately. His footsteps were deliberate, heavier than they needed to be, the kind that announced themselves without a word. He found her in the living room. At first, there may have been words, perhaps a question, perhaps an accusation. No one can fully recount them now. But whatever they were charged, carrying the tension of weeks of unresolved anger. The conversation, if it could be called that, moved quickly. Maxwell's voice carried an edge that didn't belong to an ordinary disagreement. He closed the space between them. Latrese's daughter, too young to read the weight of his body language, looked up but stayed where she was. And then, the sound. The first gunshot tore through the house. In the close confines of that living room, it was deafening, a sharp, concussive blast that rattled the windows. The 4-year-old froze instantly, her small hands gripping the edge of a pillow. The 14-year-old, in the next room, jerked his head up. The sound didn't make sense at first. He removed his headphones completely, holding his breath for a split second as he listened. Then came his second shot, followed by the third. And the unmistakable realization that something terrible was happening. He ran toward the sound. Each step down the hallway felt longer than the last, as if the floor itself was stretching beneath him. The hallway narrowed until he reached the living room doorway. What he saw will never leave him. His mother was already falling, her body reacting to the force of the bullets. Maxwell stood over her, his arm extended, the weapon steady in his grip. Another shot rang out, and another, each one echoing in the boy's chest like a physical blow. Gunfire in a confined space is more than sound. It's a physical force. The pressure wave from each shot makes the air feel thicker, the walls closer. The smell of burned gunpowder began to fill the room, mingling with something metallic that would soon become overpowering. Maxwell didn't fire once and stop. He didn't hesitate after the first few rounds. He kept going 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 shots in total, each one tearing deeper into a life that was already slipping away. When the last casing clinked onto the floor, there was silence. The kind of silence that feels wrong, that feels like it's hiding something. Smoke hung faintly in the air, the thin gray tendrils drifting toward the ceiling. Latrese lay on the floor, her eyes half open, chest still but for the faintest movement. Her daughter was pressed against the couch now, small hands covering her ears. The boy dropped to his knees beside his mother. He called her name, his voice breaking. He pressed his hands against the wounds, desperate to stop the bleeding, not yet ready to understand that there was no stopping it. Maxwell didn't kneel beside her. He didn't drop the weapon to the floor in shock. He didn't move to help. He stood there, staring, the weight of what he had done etched not in panic, but in something colder, detachment. The seconds stretched. The boy's pleas grew quieter as he realized her breathing was gone. Outside, the world moved on. A car door slammed. A laugh echoed faintly down the street. No one outside yet knew that inside this house, life had just been violently rewritten. The first neighbor to hear the shots thought it was fireworks, common in the weeks leading up to summer holidays. It wasn't until the muffled sound of a child crying reached the open air that suspicion began to creep in. But by the time help would arrive, there would be no heartbeat to find. The living room was no longer a family space. It was a crime scene, marked by bullet casings scattered on the floor and the still body of a woman who had been alive just minutes before. 10 bullets had been fired. 10 decisions to pull the trigger. 10 chances to stop and walk away. Every one of them ignored. And the man who fired them had no intention of undoing what he had just done. Maxwell's eyes scanned the space like a man assessing a job he considered finished. The gun was still in his hand. His breathing was steady, almost measured. It wasn't the rhythm of panic. It was something else, something colder. When he finally turned toward the door, he didn't run. There was no wild scramble, no tripping over furniture in haste. He walked, the same deliberate pace he had used coming in. He stepped out into the heat of the day, closing the distance to his car as if this were any ordinary departure. What he did next would be his first act in shaping the story he wanted others to believe. He later told investigators that the shooting was an accident, that somehow 10 rounds had left his weapon without intention. But his actions in those crucial minutes told a different story. A man who made no effort to save the life he had just taken. A man who left 2 children alone in a home that had just been turned into a scene of violence. Inside, the 14-year-old moved on instinct, grabbing the phone to dial for help. His voice was frantic, broken, struggling to explain what had just happened. The dispatcher's questions came quickly. Address, number of victims, condition. He gave answers as best he could, all while trying to shield his little sister from his sight on the floor. The first police units arrived within minutes, sirens cutting through the neighborhood's background noise. Officers entered to find the scene just as the children had described. Latrese motionless, the living room marked with bullet casings, blood pooling beneath her. The smell of gunpowder still clung to the air. Paramedics confirmed what was already apparent. There was no bringing her back. The focus shifted immediately from rescue to investigation. Officers secured the home, escorting the children to a neighbor's house while crime scene technicians moved in. Neighbors began to gather outside, their voices low, some whispering the name they had already guessed would be at the center of this, Earl Maxwell. One neighbor, speaking quietly to an officer, mentioned having seen his car parked down the street earlier. Another said they had noticed him in the area more than usual in recent days. Inside, detectives began collecting evidence. The positions of the shell casings told part of the story. They formed a loose arc consistent with a shooter who had been moving slightly, but always keeping his target in front of him. The grouping of bullet impacts on Latrese's body suggested close-range fire, the kind delivered when the shooter is only feet away. They noted the absence of any signs of struggle that might suggest a defensive attack by Latrese. No overturned furniture, no broken objects. This had not been a chaotic fight. It had been direct, controlled, and final. One of the most damning pieces of evidence would come from outside the home. The words of her estranged husband, Paul Dorsey. When detectives contacted him, he didn't hesitate. He told them about the 20-plus calls Maxwell had made to him in the weeks before the killing. He recounted the threats, explicit promises to kill Latrese, and strange follow-up calls where Maxwell had recanted, as if pulling the threat back made it vanish. Those threats became the spine of the prosecution's case. They established intent, a deliberate build-up to the moment on June 18th. This wasn't a man who had walked into a home and lost control in an instant. This was a man who had warned someone of what he was going to do, then followed through. Detectives also documented Maxwell's claim that the shooting had been accidental. They weighed it against the facts. 10 bullets fired, all striking the victim, with no evidence of warning shots, no marks on walls or furniture indicating a missed aim. Forensics confirmed the shots had been fired at close range, the kind of distance where every bullet is intentional. By the time the initial investigation wrapped at the scene, the picture was already becoming clear. A woman had been targeted by someone she knew and trusted. The warnings had been there, spoken out loud, and the man responsible had walked away without lifting a finger to undo what he had done. Within hours, detectives would make contact with Maxwell, and soon, the story he had tried to tell, of an accident, of a tragic misunderstanding, would unravel completely under the weight of evidence. It didn't take long for detectives to find him. The combination of eyewitness accounts, the prior threats documented by Paul Dorsey, and Maxwell's known presence in the neighborhood that day created a trail that was impossible to ignore. He didn't hide for weeks. He didn't flee across state lines. Instead, Maxwell eventually turned himself in. But even his surrender carried an air of control, like a man who thought he could manage the narrative once inside a police station. When officers placed him in an interview room, he kept his composure. His version of events was simple and unbelievable. The shooting was an accident. Somehow, in his telling, 10 bullets had discharged without intention. 10 fatal shots were the product of chance, not choice. Detectives didn't challenge every detail immediately. They let him speak, knowing that every word he offered without prompting was another piece they could later dismantle with evidence. Outside the interrogation room, news of the arrest spread quickly. Local headlines carried her name alongside his mugshot. Social media filled with photos of Latrese, smiling at a birthday party, holding her children, posted by friends and family who could barely process that she was gone. The community's shock was matched only by its anger. People had known about the threats. They had heard the warning signs. And yet, nothing had stopped the tragedy from unfolding. In October 2017, Maxwell stood in court for his preliminary hearing. The courtroom was tense. On one side sat the grieving family, including Paul Dorsey, who would testify about the chilling phone calls. On the other, Maxwell sat in a jail uniform, eyes forward, expression unreadable. Paul's testimony was clear and steady. He told the court how Maxwell had called him over and over, unable to reach Latrese directly. He repeated the exact words Maxwell had used. "When I see your wife, I'm going to kill her." He described the follow-up call, the sudden change in tone, the attempt to take the words back. The judge listened closely, noting the significance of those threats in establishing premeditation. The prosecution laid out their initial case for first-degree murder and a felony firearm violation. They argued that the evidence, the number of shots, the close range, the threats, painted a picture of deliberate intent. The defense offered little in return, relying heavily on the claim of an accidental shooting. But the physical evidence was against them. By the time the hearing concluded, the judge ruled there was more than enough evidence to send Maxwell to trial. He was bound over, and the process moved forward. Months passed as the case wound through the court system. Each time Maxwell appeared in court, the gallery was filled with family members and supporters of Latrese, wearing shirts printed with her photo and name. For them, every hearing was another reminder of the day they lost her, but also a step toward accountability. Then, in May 2018, there was an unexpected turn. Maxwell entered a plea deal, admitting guilt to second-degree murder and the felony firearm charge. The deal meant he would avoid trial, and in exchange, the prosecution would forego the first-degree charge that could have carried a life sentence without parole. For some, the plea deal felt like a relief. It meant the family wouldn't have to relive every moment of the shooting through testimony and evidence in a public courtroom. For others, it was a compromise that didn't feel like justice. 10 bullets, 2 children watching, a history of threats, and yet no life sentence. On June 7, 2018, the sentence was handed down, 25 to 50 years in prison. In the sterile calm of the courtroom, the judge read the terms. Maxwell would be in prison for decades, but the possibility of release still existed. For the family, the sentence was bittersweet. It meant he would be locked away, but it also meant that one day, possibly within their own lifetime, they might see his name again, not in a prison roster, but in a release notice. As Maxwell was led away, the weight of the past year hung in the air. Justice had been served, at least in the eyes of the law. But in the eyes of those who had loved Latrese, it was hard to reconcile years in prison with the permanence of the loss. When the sentence was read and Maxwell was led away, the courtroom emptied slowly. But the story didn't end there. It couldn't. For the 14-year-old boy who had knelt beside his mother, the memories of that day were not bound by prison walls. They followed him into every quiet moment, every restless night. He carried the weight of the sounds, each gunshot, each breath she struggled to take, in a place no one else could see. The 4-year-old grew up with pieces of the story, fragments that her mind had locked away for protection. As she got older, questions began to surface, questions no child should have to ask. Where is Mommy? Why can't she come back? And eventually, the question that burns hardest, why did he do it? In the neighborhood, her absence was felt in ways big and small. The front porch that once held her laughter stood empty. The windows that once glowed warmly at night now stayed dark. Friends still passed her house and felt the sting of remembering that she had been taken from it. The loss rippled out. It wasn't just her children who suffered. It was her parents, her siblings, her friends. It was the coworkers who expected her smile each morning. It was the church members who had saved her a seat. Her absence was a hole that nothing could fill. And yet, the signs had been there. The threats had been spoken out loud. The danger had been named. But like so many stories in the long, grim history of intimate partner violence, it had been underestimated until it was too late. Every year, thousands of women are killed by someone they once trusted. Many of them had heard the words, "I'm going to kill you," and lived with the hope that the threat would pass. Many of them were wrong. And too often, those who could have intervened didn't believe it was serious until they were standing at a graveside. We saw Latrese smile. We saw her with her children. But we didn't see the tightening grip of control. We didn't see the moments she hid from the world to keep the peace. We didn't see the fear that may have flickered in her mind, but was pushed aside in the hope that things would get better. And now, the only thing left is a warning. A warning for anyone listening. Threats are never just words. Jealousy can become violence faster than you think. And love should never be confused with possession. If you're watching this and you've ever heard words like the ones spoken to Latrese, take them seriously. If you've seen controlling behavior in a friend's relationship, speak up. If you felt unsafe in your own home, find a way out before the door closes behind you. If you believe these stories matter, subscribe now, because the next one could be someone you know. And if you choose not to, go into the comments and explain why. Explain why you would let stories like Latrese fade into silence. Be careful who you trust. Not every smile is safe. Rest in peace, Latrese Morris-Dorsey. Your name will not be forgotten.